Thank you. Good morning. Let's check we have everything working here. I'm Tuomas Karmakallio from FIVR, the Finnish Virtual Reality Association. We've been operating for a couple of years. Our mission has been to expand the Finnish VR AR developer scene. We're providing free workspaces in Helsinki, Turku and Tampere for promising teams with absolutely no strings attached. That's sort of our primary mission, is running these hubs, and in addition we're doing various cooperation with Tekes, Nordic VR startups, etc. to push the groundwork here. Clicker, click, let's see, click forwards, click, yep. We have a website through which Finnish developers particularly are invited to join our organization for free. We have a Slack channel where we host a major part of Finnish VR developers and companies interested in the field. So our Facebook group is fairly active with over 1,000 people following stuff happening in Finland. But yeah, gaming on the grassroots level is my speech today. We've been running at the Assembly Computer Festival, a VR zone, for the last couple of years. And this year we had, for example, a mixed reality show where we had a VR sportsman being captured live on stage, attracting more attention. And this year, really, we started getting more and more people actually asking us whether it is now the time ripe for them to actually buy these toys, and I'm answering very positively that yes, now is a good time. The headsets are getting cheaper. If you have a gaming rig, go for it. People ask me whether they should wait because there might be the next generation around the corner. My answer is briefly that there should be no rush for a next generation to come, and peripherals and such may be coming out, but it's all slowly working out. I'm sure there's several years in this current generation to go. Interesting developments people ask me about are stuff like warehouse scale tracking and new knuckles controllers and possible headset upgrades, and all this is possibly coming, but honestly, the situation is good enough right now that if you're interested, I tell the kids and their parents particularly that now is a good time to get on board. And clearly more and more than the previous year, there are parents asking me which headsets they should be getting, and I'm a bit of an agnostic here, that I try to tell them that they're all great and you should investigate yourself, try them out, go to arcades, try out the Vives. The Vives are obviously more popular now, but Oculus is matching up quite nicely with their efforts at room scale. A little bit about this first-time users here. So this sort of VR zone is very similar to running an arcade, and arcades are probably one of the major areas where people are going to be trying VR for the first time, in addition to trying them at their friend's place. So I'll be talking a little bit also to the developers out there. It's very easy to contact the local arcade now and get your game up there at a local arcade if you want to get some real hands-on testing. Well recommended. There's now 3 arcades in Greater Helsinki, 2 by Pixeli, 1 small one in Kallio. And they're very friendly. At our VR zone, we've been focusing on showing very solid known products with an easy curve to get in, like Funhouse, Tilt Brush and Rec Room. They're easy to get into fast, and this is very critical at a convention with 10 minutes per user and volunteers running the stands who don't have time to get acquainted with a lot of different games. And this sort of ties into the developer, that if you will be running a stand at a convention, you really want to have an experience that the player can get their teeth into very quickly. A 5 minutes to 10 minutes maximum per player. You want to minimize the time onboarding this user. You don't want to be having to lift their headsets up and telling them what to do if they're stuck. It needs to be right into it and have a sort of super minimalist tutorial experience where you really get into the game with as minimum hassle as possible. One person should be able to run 2 stations at a time, but you need to stay very aware of both users so they don't get stuck or frustrated during the game. And remember to use VR covers to alleviate sweat problems. Now, this is really one of the challenges VR currently faces, is that there's a bit of a process to get new users into the game. They have to be acquainted with the headset, the controllers, and you have to have external headphones if you're not using Oculus. And then you have to take everything off again. You have to manage things, wipe everything down, pay attention to the user during the experience. You need a human being to help at all times. You can't leave anybody to play around at the moment, and it will take a few years for people to reach the stage that everybody knows what they're doing. Hygiene is an absolute critical issue. I still see all the time people demoing without the requisite VR covers for sweat management. I implore you to acquire these little upgrades for that. There are several extra software options where you can also upgrade the situation. You can, for example, via Chaperone, I believe you can talk directly to the user in VR without taking their headsets off and so forth. We're seeing a rise of early adopters and hardcore users now. These are also a critical mass, I think, where we have now at least a few million users spread across the 3 high-end headsets. While device sales haven't been quite as big as people have hoped, this dedicated niche of hardcore gamers is clearly established, and they're communicating well on various channels like Facebook and Reddit. Facebook groups are friendly for first-time users, first-time acquirers of their devices are continually asking about tips for troubleshooting and new games. I think the biggest drivers of user retention is probably now people showing these new toys to their friends, and content is starting to mature to the point there are more and more games out there with long-term entertainment value, in addition to the sort of short demos we've been seeing for a few years. There's a huge amount of visibility and activity of gamers actively seeking content. People are sharing their experiences with their games, and average posts can gain 50 posts of people just wanting to tell their opinions on what to play. And this is a positive indicator of a pretty healthy and eager early adopter community. We're seeing speedrunners doing VR games. The Facebook user groups are growing fast. There's between 10 and 30,000 users in various groups. There's a lot of overlap, of course. Virtual sculpting is an interesting side note. There's a couple of thousand hardcore users into just sculpting. Twitch streams, more and more VR themes, streams on average coming out. YouTube, there's sites like Orange, Annoying Orange, millions of views continually. Mario Kart VR, when it came out, the first video got millions of views instantly. So there's clearly a lot of interest in the area. Most of the biggest YouTube numbers are actually from YouTubers who don't really focus on VR. But there's dozens of significant YouTubers with nearing 1 million followers, from Jacksepticeye to Nathy. if you're a developer, you probably want your game out to these guys. Briefly about hardware, I'm not going to go over much in detail since I assume a lot of you are familiar with this sort of thing. 20% of Steam users now own VR-ready PCs, of which a total, again, 2% of Steam users have VR devices. In the past couple of years, a lot of the sort of sore point has been the buy-in price. Nowadays, off the shelf, any gaming rig is now pretty much VR ready. That threshold is now easier and easier to overcome. And the devices, HMDs, are also becoming cheaper by the year, which makes things a lot easier. There's a bit of a disconnect between the control schemes, though. As Oculus came out without controllers, they lagged behind a little bit. PSVR similarly actually has a serious problem here where they based a lot of their first games on having to have a support for a traditional controller, but hopefully they're catching up. Room scale, only 42% of users have even 2x2 meters at home. So the idea of making games with a lot of space to walk around is currently a suicide. This is something Oculus and PSVR got right, in my opinion, that they focused on this sort of front-facing games. They acknowledge the fact that the majority of users simply don't have huge space to play around in. Some experimental game makers were so bold as to make games that fit in 4x3. They used the maximum room space. That was a great experiment, but they didn't do that well. Big IP is getting on the train. We have promised Skyrim, Fallout, Monster Hunter, LA Noire, Mario Kart. So this is another promising sign that your average user will be very happy to have big IP in the field. Despite some of these being retrofitted to VR, I believe they will be quite successful. The Resident Evil showed the way, and even though there will be issues, I don't think it's a huge problem. While I do say to young developers that you should make your game ground up for VR, since the control scheme is so unique, and then I'd really focus now on the gaming. And I'd like to remind everybody that we are creating totally new games today. The control scheme has never existed before. Games like this have been impossible to create with any pre-existing tech. We've never been able to give users the abstraction of their own real hands in a game. The level of immersion, the intensity of immersion is totally unforeseen. Existing games being adapted to VR can work, and it's working fine in shooters and simulators particularly. But games where you want to do stuff hands-on, you're in new territory, you're making games that are really breaking ground. And this works also for people who are making games from their own realm of expertise. For example, real-time strategy games being made by the creators of Age of Empire 2 called Brass Tactics, and they understood the situation. They're not just retrofitting a game, they're creating it from the ground up. They're making it work with your touch controllers, and they're simplifying everything. There's no more nested drop-down menus and such things. There's new sort of experiences coming out where games are showing people things that could never have happened. Like there's a short anecdote from Onward where a person got shot, only wounded, so he dropped prone, played dead. His opponents walked past. He rose up and took him out from behind. This, again, unforeseen things. While people diss motion sickness, there's a clear variety of people who enjoy freedom of movement. This should not be discounted. Teleport, freedom of movement, hand-waving movement, all these experiments are still being done. There's no solid solid way to say that you're wrong to do freedom of movement. If you feel it suits your game, Onward is another good example of where it works. Steam Spy shows us a lot of good data on sales, even though you always take it with a grain of salt. Games like Gorn and Res Infinite have racked up the requisite about 20,000 units sold, which indicate a solid, if not mind-blowing, revenue. This is just on the Steam platform. If you release on all 3 major platforms, you will be doing okay if you're in the top 20 of games. It's granted this is a tough time. It's time for pioneers to lay down the groundwork, make your dream games. If you can hit the sweet spot, you might make it out okay, but it's tough. You're gonna need a runway. You hopefully have a good war chest, perhaps some funding would be wise to acquire. But like I said, there's a couple of games out there who have shown it well. Windland from Finland is a great example of a game that struck early gold. Climby is a nice example of a very low-budget game that's doing quite well. So I'm going to keep it pretty short today. Time runs really fast. Make something fun, innovative. Make sure you have money to survive. Good luck.
That's a nice way to finish up with. So, some questions from the audience. One question. So, it looks like it was a very clear aspect. So I've got a question from you, Tuomas. Like, how much runway do you think is needed?
Well, making a game is a slow and painstaking process, as probably we all know in this. I'd say half a year to make a small, tiny game. If you're lucky, you might get a hit. Most games of any serious depth and scope take a year or two to develop. I think a good note here is to take that small prototype, launch it on itch, for example, get good early feedback, like Gorn, for example, did that. And they waited to make sure it's rock solid before launching on Steam, and now they're doing very well.
Okay, splendid. Let's thank Tuomas for his presentation.